and to understand that in order to be happy, we don't have to be miserable first. We don't have to be miserable at all. And so that's really what I try to talk about is how can you be happy in your life throughout and have a contented, balanced life and still have the kind of professional success you're looking for.
Imagine it's 12 months from now and you've achieved your major life goals. How does it feel to be in the best shape of your life? To wake up energized, excited about the day, to have great relationships and friends who support you and propel you forward. How does it feel to have an excess of money, to be able to make the choices you want, to be fearless and open to trying new adventures? Imagine being connected to the universe and it providing everything you desire. It's possible over time, and your past does not dictate your future. The only thing holding you back from this vision is you. It's time to take control of our thoughts and use them to our advantage. Welcome to Richer Soul, where we achieve our dreams and bring balance to health, wealth, relationships, time, and spirituality. If you have not had a chance to listen to episodes 1 through 9, I encourage you to go back and listen to the framework behind Richer Soul and how to create the life of your dreams. You can also find all the show notes for this episode at richersoul.com. Hey, it's Rocky. Welcome to Richer Soul. Today's guest is Charles Price to talk about his book, Rewiring the White Collar Mind. Today's quote comes from Walt Whitman, and it's in our guest's book. I inhale great draughts of space. The east and the west are mine. The north and the south are mine. I am larger, better than I thought. I did not know I held so much goodness. How many of us play smaller than we are, having so much holding us back? Well, let's change that. Happy New Year. Let's make 2024 your best year ever. Today we've got Charles Price. He's an accomplished lawyer with over 40 years of experience. And we're going to chat about his book, Rewiring the White Collar Mind. He provides powerful insights and lessons from his journey, realizing that the pursuit of prestige and money wasn't bringing him happiness. Sound familiar? He also found many high-achieving professionals struggle to balance their drive for success with their personal well-being and being present in life. His goal is to help professionals incorporate more emotional intelligence, stress management, and life balance. You know I don't like that word. It's harmony. Let's create the song that we really want to sing. Let's meet our guest. Welcome to Richer Soul, Charles Price. It's great to have you join us today.
Thanks so much, Rocky. Great to be here.
I'm excited about our conversation and to learn from you. We always like to start at the beginning. What was it like when you were growing up, and how much did your family and school teach you about money?
So I had what you would probably consider a pretty standard sort of middle-class life that started in the 50s. My dad worked his way from being a stock boy at Sears to eventually being a store manager and a mall manager and all that stuff. And my parents got divorced when I was 12, and my stepdad was a college professor. So I sort of saw some variety there in terms of role models. I will say, and I don't know how typical this is, probably fairly typical, there wasn't a lot of sort of conscious transmission of wisdom about money per se. It was obviously there in the background. We had enough money to sort of, go on a vacation once in a while. We weren't wealthy by any stretch. But I don't really remember learning any particular money lessons until I started teaching myself as I got into adulthood.
And so school didn't teach you anything either?
I don't think so, no.
And you went to law school, and I always make fun of this because it's the one class that you don't have to take in law school, which is math class, which also means they're not teaching you money either.
Well, it is funny. I went to the University of Chicago Law School, which was quite famous then and to some extent now for being the sort of epicenter of the economic analysis of law. So we learned a lot of economics in that sense. That time in the 70s, they were kind of trying to analyze all legal problems from the standpoint of economics. I don't know that there was much in terms of personal finance that was involved, but there was a lot of quantitative analysis and economic analysis.
That is not the norm for law school.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay. Very, very different. Why'd you pick law?
My grandfather, Rocky, said that he had a letter that I wrote when I was 12 years old where I said something about wanting to be a lawyer. So it was obviously a very early thing for me. And why would a 12-year-old think that? I think there was probably something about sort of the life of the mind and maybe something about performance. I always sort of envisioned myself as a trial lawyer, and that's what I became. So it was an early kind of goal of mine.
But do you remember wanting to be a lawyer, or was it more your grandfather letter telling you about the letter?
No, I do. I do remember wanting to be a lawyer, and I'll give you a concrete example. I was offered a paying gig to be a manager of a snack bar on Huntington Beach. So basically to be paid to spend time like hanging out, with the beach people and the beautiful women in bikinis and so on as a teenager. And I passed that up to take a non-paying job at a courthouse where I could kind of, start being in that world. It's an odd decision. I don't think many teenagers would have made it, but certainly by that point, I was pretty set on my path.
And so during college, because it came up in the book, you seemed to be rather angry.
Why?
What was that all about?
Well, yeah, that's a really important one. And I do talk about that in Rewiring the White Collar Mind, because that was kind of the first thing that needed to be rewired in my case. It wasn't just that I was angry for a lot of reasons that sort of made sense to the psychiatrist that I go to in chapter 1. And I, he kind of, got me to sort of talk about myself. And at first it was this sort of, nice glossy advertisement for how successful I was. But then he got me to acknowledge that my parents had gotten divorced. My stepdad had died unexpectedly from a massive heart attack. My girlfriend had left me.
Sounds like a country song.
Exactly. Right. He said, the way a psychiatrist would respond to something like that, wow, it sounds like there might be some room for anger there. And, I said, well, not really. Those things happen to people and you just pick yourself up and move on kind of thing. And so it wasn't just, so there's obviously a bubbling cauldron of anger there for me. But more than that, I just really had never been taught to have access to kind of all the emotions I was feeling. I could feel good about being successful at some level. But boy, all that negative, dark side stuff, that was just a total mystery to me. And as I say in the book, it expressed itself in my having a blinding headache, basically morning, noon, and night for a couple of years. And I thought this must be some physical thing, or who knows what's going on with me. And that's kind of how I ended up in this psychiatrist's office. That was the beginning of kind of a lifelong journey of accessing the things that had been there all along.
And that kind of touches on something of a lot of times our emotions show up as something else, right? In this case, you had headaches. I remember for the longest time, people would have back pain as part of that. People would have ulcers as part of that. People might have migraines. And a lot of times that's why you go to the doctor and they're like, well, we don't know. We don't see anything wrong. And more often than not, it's not necessarily a physical problem. It is an emotional or mental issue that's causing that to happen.
100%. That's exactly what was going on with me. And as I say, it was, I had to really start from square one in terms of accessing my emotions. Just, it's okay to be an emotional being, and you are inherently an emotional being. So you can deny that or not be aware of it, but that's like saying that you don't need to breathe. That's how we're wired. And I even talk in the book about having this sort of virtual council that I had kind of assembled in my mind, because I had this feeling that I wasn't getting, all the kind of guidance I needed in my life. But as you would expect, the council that I assembled had all of the sort of defects that I had at the time. Sherlock Holmes was in there, Mr., intellectual, no emotions and everything. That was like my idol. And so that was a limited utility, shall we say. But you're quite right. The emotions are there, whether you understand them, acknowledge them, express them in a healthy way or not. And for me, they tended to express themselves in physical ways.
I'm guessing you were in college in the 60s?
I started college in 72.
So a little bit later. But still, you're growing up in the era of, that was kind of the way, the Marlboro Man. You don't show emotion other than anger, and you don't talk about the softer side of being a male.
Well, yes, I would say it was the beginning of a transition period. Certainly what you're saying would absolutely apply to the 50s, early 60s, and then, of course, by the mid to late 60s, we had all the controversy in the country and tumult and people in the streets and hippies and all that. So, there's kind of out there in the culture, you were starting to see people kind of exploring a different way than the Marlboro Man way. But it was just at the beginning of all of that, I would say.
And that's funny. I wonder how many people realize that we had race riots and wars and all kinds of problems back then. It seems like we've gone full circle again. Well,
those of us who lived through 1968 is really considered to be kind of the worst, year in that regard. But we lost Martin Luther King to assassination, Bobby Kennedy. We had massive race riots across probably 70 cities in the country that dark summer. There was a crazy Democratic National Convention that year. So that was a bad year. And, so for those of us that lived through 68 at some level of awareness, people say this has never been worse. Well, in some ways we're facing dangers that we probably didn't face then, but we certainly had a lot of division and certainly violence back then.
And I don't think people realize that, or they've forgotten it.
Right.
Because if you don't live through it, you don't realize it at all. So what inspired you to write the book, Rewiring the White Collar Mind?
I started giving talks, Rocky, probably 10 or 15 years ago at Arizona State Law School, and I gave some seminars to lawyers about these issues because the more I kind of looked within myself and kind of understood the journey that I had gone on and accessing my emotions and just living a fuller life, I realized that there's something here that I'd love to be able to share with other people in some way. And the more I talked about it with friends, talked about it in seminars, I thought there is a book here, but it's got to be, a real, honest, vulnerable book. It can't just be kind of a list of bullet points, because people need to hear how I came to have these, I'll say, learn from my mistakes.
We can always learn from our mistakes or someone else's. So, our whole goal here is to let people learn from your mistakes so that they don't have to necessarily go through it. What I have found, though, is that most people just have to make the mistake themselves, unfortunately.
Well, I think that's right. And, and that's fine. Everybody's going to come to the book at a different place of experience and awareness. And for when I talk to older audiences, lawyers that have been at this for a long time, I often get this kind of epiphany. You're telling me things that I've been struggling with for many years. It's a different reaction with a younger audience, a law student audience, for example, but they do understand that they're hearing something that's valuable to them. They just probably don't quite have an understanding of how valuable and important these things are. I have had lawyers come up to me and say, the most valuable hour I spent in law school was the hour that you talked to us. And one thing I tell them is, think about what you're learning. Think about the law school curriculum. You're being taught to read cases, which is studying precedent, as we say, and that's looking backwards. And you're being taught to strategize, which is looking forward. But you're never taught to live right now. And yet everybody knows that that's kind of the basis for a healthy life. So we can see that we're actually being taught things that will lead us, if we follow them dutifully and carefully, like the good A students that we all are, to be professionally successful, but personally miserable. Don't we need to rewire that? That's kind of how I get into my talk.
And that's how you essentially spent your 20s and 30s, isn't it?
For sure. I was very dutiful in kind of following the metrics and the incentives of my profession. I talk about in the book that there was a whole year that I sort of spent just kind of following the financial incentives and saying everything is going to take a backseat to that because, that's how I'm being rewarded and recognized. So, everything is in second place to that. And it wasn't a particularly pleasant year, of course. I don't really recall that it was a super spectacular year in terms of my external compensation. And that's about the time I started thinking, well, this is nuts. I could maybe do that for a year, but I can't do this for the rest of my life. What am I supposed to do? Because I would look ahead and see the older lawyers in my firm and elsewhere, and I didn't want their lives and their families and so on. So I thought, I guess I'm going to have to figure this out on my own.
And I don't know how many people take the time to look at the leadership in the organizations that they're at and say, the people who are 20 years ahead of me in this gig, are they the people I want to be in 20 years?
Exactly.
Because if you look at that and go, oh my God, I don't want to end up like that, well, then it's time to make a change.
Exactly. Right. And, that's sort of, I think for a lot of us, certainly in my case, that's the first time that you've really kind of had that sort of a crossroads in your life. Because for all of us, when we're in school, we kind of look up to our teachers and we think, well, that's a nice life. And they're sort of doing their thing and they come in and give us their wisdom. So that's fine. That I could see that. And a lot of people, obviously, people do go into teaching law school or whatever it is. But then you get out into what we are pleased to call the real world. And you just say, look at all the people who have been following the incentives that I'm being given and look where they ended up. Is that where I want to end up? And if it isn't, then you've got a choice to make.
That is correct. You have a choice to make. I find most people don't necessarily look forward and actually think about that. They just follow along blindly.
Well, think about the power of messaging in our consumer society, the power of propaganda. I mean, anybody with eyes to see can understand that, we're getting all sorts of messaging that isn't necessarily all that healthy. And what I'm really talking about in the book is there is a level of propaganda and messaging that goes on in the corporate world that is super powerful, but it's not necessarily even intentional by the people who are sending those messages. For any organization that is constructed to keep the doors open and the lights on and turn a profit, of necessity, most of the messages you're sending out are, here's our bills, here's our collections, here's where you fit in, you were successful, you weren't successful. Okay, that's fine. That makes sense from the standpoint of the organization. And I don't really even fault the leaders of organizations that behave that way. That's just kind of the way things are structured. But I'm asking people to step back and say, given that you are receiving all those messages in a very concrete, quantitative way from your work environment, your professional environment, and it's extremely hard for type A people, accomplished, successful people to not respond to those incentives. What kind of messages is the rest of your life sending? Because it is sending some messages, but they're softer, they're less quantitative. How urgent is it when your young daughter says, I've got a softball game on Friday afternoon, let's say, versus, I've got some work thing. And I'm not saying you always ought to pick, the family obligation or the personal obligation, but at least I want people to be making conscious choices. What am I making the right set of choices in my 20s, 30s, and 40s that are going to lead me to have the kind of life I want and to be in some acceptable place when I'm in my 60s and 70s?
And in that sense, I think you're a little different in that you actually think forward. Not everyone does. So there was a quote in the book that kind of jumped out at me. And I'd love for you to kind of talk about it and maybe give us a little more context. It was if I'm doing so great, why do I feel so bad?
Yeah, that was something I would ask myself, pretty regularly, particularly early on in my career. And that was kind of the big disconnect for me, the first big disconnect. If I'm hitting all these goals, I'm doing the things that are expected of me and then some. I'm trying cases when I'm only 2 or 3 years out of law school, and I'm winning cases and et cetera. When do I get the payoff? I call this the constantly receding horizon. We do all these things so that we will feel better at some future point. I will feel better when I make law review, when I get a good job, when I make partner, when I win this case, when I make a certain amount of money. And I realized we're actually training ourselves to not live in the present, to constantly chase these rewards that are going to show up at some hypothetical point in the future. And they never show up, because what we've actually done is trained ourselves to keep looking ahead and not appreciate and enjoy the life that we have now. So the answer to that question was, why am I doing so well and feeling so miserable? Is nobody teaches us how to enjoy our lives. Item one. Item two, most of the things that we are being taught to do and incentivized to do lead us away from having kind of a balanced and contented life. That's the central message of the book.
Are you noticing a difference with the younger generation? Or do they have a different outlook, or are they still kind of following that in the legal profession?
No, it's such a good question, Rocky. And I absolutely do notice a difference. And here's the difference. When I give a talk, let's say, to an older audience, my age plus or minus, often the response is, wow, I never thought of that. You must be some kind of savant to have, these great insights that the messages we're getting are not that healthy. When I talk to a younger audience, I'm saying the messages you're getting are not that healthy. They're like, yeah, no kidding. Really? Thanks for, stating the obvious. So they kind of, for a variety of reasons, you think about where they grew up, the 2008 recession and so on. I think they look at my generation and they say, you're not exactly crushing it in terms of the world you're leaving us. We don't particularly like the life that you're leading. So they're open to the message that the incentives you're getting are not really on track. Let's think about it. But they don't quite know what to do from there. What does it look like to lead a balanced life? A balanced life in the case of many a millennial is to have a main job and 3 side gigs. And they might feel, burned out and overwhelmed by that. So is that really the right approach? So I try to talk about solutions that I think will work for everybody, but you're quite right. The generations think about these things in a different way.
Interesting. So in the book, there was another quote that kind of along the same lines, which was, to be happy, you must be successful. To be successful, you must work hard. To work hard is to be miserable. Therefore, to be happy, you must be miserable. Yes. This is kind of a dichotomy of the logic here.
I call it the great paradox. And when I spell it out, everybody's kind of nodding along with each of the premises. And then you get to the conclusion, to be happy, you must be miserable. And they're like, that doesn't sound right. There must be some mischief in the premises. And surely there is. But you really have to kind of wake up a little bit to see where the mischief is. And to understand that in order to be happy, we don't have to be miserable first. We don't have to be miserable at all. And so that's really what I try to talk about is how can you be happy in your life throughout and have a contented, balanced life and still have the kind of professional success you're looking for.
Do you have to work hard?
Well, I think you do at some level. And what I'm talking to a group of law students in a couple of weeks, and I plan to tell them, basically, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. I know you're skeptical about some of the messaging. I totally get that. But be aware, you have to work hard in order to develop the skills to be a good lawyer or be good at whatever your chosen field is. And then you can use that. You use those skills in whatever way you see fit to pursue your life goals. But I do think that you need to work hard to learn anything, the famous 10,000 hours and so on.
But that's the question. Do the 10,000 hours really have to be hard? Can they be fun? Can they be enjoyable? Can they be things you love to do? Like, why does it have to be? Now, I understand, and I've never worked in a law firm, but I can imagine that if you're a young person coming into a law firm, they make you work ridiculous hours just to, not because it's useful, but because they just have these attitudes.
Okay. Now you've asked exactly the right question. Because we have to peel apart, what do we mean by working hard? And that's why I kind of phrased the paradox the way that I did, because what we hear when we hear working hard is being miserable. And the kind of implicit lesson is work hard and be miserable now so you can be miserable, so you can be happy later. But what you're really teaching yourself to do is to be miserable later, because that's what you're practicing. Okay. So how do you work hard and be happy, basically? And this also goes to the notion of sort of life balance. Everybody talks about life balance. Well, I'm a little skeptical of that also, because the implicit assumption there is that the work is terrible and hard and taxing, and we have to balance that out with things in our life that are good and pleasant and fun, and then it'll be balanced out. And I want to peel that apart too and say, is that necessarily the way we have to look at, quote, the work side of our life? And what I believe is you can look for opportunities for engagement and connection and presence and contributing throughout your workday, throughout your work life. So the balance you're looking for is minute by minute and second by second. It's not balancing out these 50 weeks of misery with these 2 weeks of vacation. Okay. And so to me, and I there's a chapter in there in the book about what it means to work hard. And I talk about being at Game 7 of that epic World Series between the Diamondbacks and the Yankees, which the Diamondbacks won with a thrilling ninth inning bloop single by Luis Gonzalez. Randy Johnson comes in relief in the 8th inning, and he's never basically pitched relief, but he comes in to save the day. And so he does it and everybody's happy. Okay. But the point is, nobody's going to say that Randy Johnson is not a hard worker. But his definition of hard work is building his skills and keeping them in tip-top shape. It's not, throwing 100-mile-an-hour fastballs 8 hours a day. So to me, to work hard is to be fully engaged, to understand the task at hand, to be immersed in what you're doing in the moment, and to say, right now, this is the thing that's before me. And I think you can be as happy and engaged and content while you're doing, quote, work as you are having a lovely, relaxed dinner with friends. At least I hope so. I've tried to model that, and I try to talk about that in the book.
And you have to figure out how that works for you. And if it doesn't work for you, then go do something else. I think today, more than ever, we have more choices in how we do things. So I have learned to stop using the word balance because nobody can achieve it. Everyone thinks that means everything's equal, and it's never going to be equal. We talk a little bit more about harmony. At different points, different things are going to come to the forefront. So maybe in your particular industry, if you're going the trial, well, the couple weeks leading up to the trial, you're probably going to be working a lot. But then harmony is the couple weeks after the trial, you go be with your family and you learn to go back and forth, to ebb and flow and figure out how to do that. I think too many people don't realize that you can do that, nor do they make the time or the intention to do that up front. And I think that's the key, is figure it out for you and say no. Like, no is a powerful word and it works. And I will say corporate has Corporate does their best to make you think you can't say no because they always want you to say yes. But when you learn to say no, then it's amazing how freeing that is.
Yeah, I think that's right. And once you learn to put your own well-being in a position of priority and the well-being of your family and people that are close to you, then it is possible to say no. And also your yeses become more powerful because they're fully informed. For sure, when you're headed to trial, everybody in your life knows you're just going to be unavailable for long periods of time. I did a trial a couple of years ago that was in Chicago, and I was gone for 6 weeks and basically unavailable. And everybody around you understands that. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't be fully focused and dedicated on the things you're doing in that sense. But if you're doing that all the time and your family's suffering and distant and your kids have to have name tags on, then you're probably not all that harmonious, to use your phrase.
Today's episode is sponsored by Profit Answer Man Podcast. Did you know that most small business owners hate looking at their financials? It's one reason they may struggle with business success. The Profit Answer Man podcast helps them ensure they are profitable and can pay their employees and weather the storms we all have to face. It's built on the Profit First methodology of pay yourself first. The Profit Answer Man podcast is a must listen to for every small business owner and anyone who wants to help them survive and thrive. Check it out on your favorite listening platform. No, you're not. And again, it's just having the courage to say no. And I think for a lot of people that is difficult. But once you learn it, it is powerful. And sometimes you have to be willing to walk away, which is okay too. You can walk away and there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I think one thing that the younger generation is better at than my generation is understanding that, some workplaces are a good fit for you and some aren't. I think there was a notion during my career that, moving from one place to another was a sign of shame or failure or could be perceived as such. I think that's less true now. But I would say find a place where you are comfortable that you're valued and appreciated for exactly what you bring, and then give it your all. There's a deep pleasure in totally devoting yourself to something while you're doing the work. And then, as we say, we need to all recognize that there are other aspects to our life as well, and we need to attend to those.
And I grew up with the same thought pattern. We were told, if you don't stay at a job and you job hunt or hop, that looks bad on your resume, that you won't get another job and so forth. And that has dramatically shifted. The average person, I don't think, stays in a job more than a couple of years now. So the rules of the game have changed and you got to learn to change with them.
I think that's right. And I do think that the younger generation is going to be, and in my experience has been, very receptive to my message of, let's really take a close look at the messages we're getting, the incentives that we're working under. I think they're fine with exploring that. Exactly what that looks like continues to be a mystery to them as to other age groups. What does it mean to really live your life in a way that you're contented with and overall satisfied with? That's a challenge for everybody.
First, you have to define it.
Exactly.
Because if you don't know what you want, you can't have it. You don't know what to say yes and no to.
Right.
When you become very clear on what you want and how you want to do things, you can find the opportunities and the places that match your desires.
So I do some private coaching, and one of my exercises is, what does an ideal day look like for you? Okay. Exactly what does it feel like? What are you doing? What are your emotions? And if you haven't taken the time to kind of map that out, how do you know where you're going? If you're making sacrifices now in order to get there, don't you have to know what there looks like and feels like?
You very much do. So one of the other things that popped up in the book was a quote, and this one has always been very true throughout when I was working in corporate. We love you as long as you achieve, which is, what have you done for me lately? They forget everything you did over time, and it's always like more. And it's a constant, and at some point it becomes overwhelming.
It can. Let's just have an open conversation about that. I'm really interested in your thoughts too, Rocky, because you're right. It's unhealthy to feel like I'm only as good as last week, last quarter. Okay, we can all see how unhealthy that is. But I think it's fair to say that there's inherently a transactional aspect to virtually any job we have, unless we're self-employed. And even then, we can talk about that. But if I go sign up with a new law firm, they're going to say, "You seem like a nice guy. That'd be fun to have around. Whatever." But if I'm not bringing in money and they're giving me a paycheck, at some point there could be an imbalance there. And it doesn't really matter that I made a lot of money for my firm 10 years ago. What are you doing for me now? And I don't resent that. I understand that. The key for me is the transaction a fair one? In other words, that I would make a similar decision if I were in charge of that, plus or minus some percentage for, people can differ. But also, to keep that aspect of our life in perspective. Because what happens is that we say, my income went down by 10% this year, so I'm 10% less worthy as an individual. I tell the story of Christopher Wren, the great architect, walking through St. Paul's Cathedral, which he was rebuilding in the wake of the Great London Fire. And he was talking to some workmen, and he asked one of the workmen who didn't recognize him, "What are you doing?" "Well, I'm laying some tile." Another one, "What are you doing?" "Well, I'm putting in a stained glass window." The third workman said, "I'm helping Mr. Christopher Wren build a beautiful cathedral." I always try to keep that kind of perspective in mind. What's the cathedral that we're building, whatever the particular transaction is that we're engaged in at the moment.
And I agree. It just becomes, I think the question is they keep moving the bar. And so you end up on a hamster wheel that you can never win. And that's more, I think, what I'm talking about, where the bar keeps getting raised and raised and raised, and it becomes essentially unachievable. Or, as you say, you achieve it, but your reward for all that extra becomes less and less and less over time. And that's what we've noticed, is that you don't get the credit for all that is happening.
Well, I've lived in both kinds of systems. I have lived in a compensation system in which it just so happens that what you excelled at this year is the thing we rewarded last year. This year we're looking for XYZ, and you don't find out till after the end. And that was highly toxic for me and very disorienting, very stressful. Now I'm in an organization where they're as transparent as humanly possible. This is what we reward. The people who made more than you did brought in X amount of money more than you did. I'm like, okay, cool, I get it. That's probably the decision I would make too. I think that's the best you can hope for, is that you understand how decisions are made. And if you don't understand it, and it's constantly stressful and unfair and moving bars and so on, moving goalposts, then I'd say, might be time to think about a change.
And I think it was more the latter that I was talking about. The other things is sometimes you have to, and I know because I was in sales, and people don't think of attorneys as being in sales, but essentially you are. You've got to bring in cases, which is sales. There were times where the company would have to choose. So in your case, you could bring in a wonderful client, but they go, "Oh, we can't accept that client because we represent so-and-so."
Yep.
And, that happens. Or they start to say, "Well, yeah, that's all wonderful, but we'd rather do X. So that's where we want you to focus," which goes back to what your other point was. They don't tell you till after the fact, or their goals outweigh your goals. So it becomes a political and life mess. But that is a cultural problem.
It 100% is. And let me ask you, if you were in charge of designing a system that was going to be ultimately fair and as least stressful as it could be, what would that look like for you?
So, you do have to define it up front and well up front. In other words, if you're going to roll something out for 2024, you need to roll it out in 2023. So people know what's coming in 2024. And I think it needs to, from the person rolling it out, be careful what you reward because you will get it and there are unintended consequences. So you may foster bad behavior. And then you also have to have the flexibility so that when the needs of the firm are greater than the needs or that particular business of that particular person, you have to say, look, we don't want that client, but because you did the work, we're going to share a little bit with you for that work because we said no, not because of that. So I think it's doing all those different things and being fair about it.
I think that's a perfect summary. I will say, I'll give a shout out to the firm I'm with now. It's called Dickinson Wright. They've done a very good job at basically all those levels. When you come into the firm, sometimes you might be on a contract where it's sort of, you're not fully a part of the compensation system yet, but they have you go through the process as sort of a practice run so you can kind of know what to expect the next year. Okay. And then there's a written set of criteria. This is what we reward and how we weigh it. And then you can talk to all the people you want to who sit on the committee. It's hard to do better than that.
I think the other last one is when other people take credit for your work.
Yeah, that's brutal.
And some people are very good at doing that, depending on where you are in the totem pole, right? You bring in the work, but then the people above you take all the credit and they don't remember that it was your contact. Yeah. So
I've been there too. I'm sure you have too, Rocky. And I guess I would say, I think we're getting to a point culturally, particularly with this younger generation, which I totally applaud, where they're just not going to put up with that. They're going to say, if, burn me once, I'm out of here. I'll, form my own firm, start my own company, go join somebody else. And I think that level of job portability is going to lead to some more accountability because it's hard to have a totally toxic work environment when people have choices.
And I agree with you. I think it is changing for the better. One of the other things that you talk about in the book is the power of listening. Can we chat a little bit about that?
Yeah, I just think that's so important. Virtually all of us who receive professional training are taught to talk, and we're taught to give answers and share our revealed wisdom. And that is in direct conflict with something that we all know about ourselves, which is that we love to be listened to. I have yet to meet a person who doesn't like to be listened to. And so I have a whole chapter on, how important it is to listen and some tips on how to listen. But most of all, just when somebody's talking, just be quiet. That's one of my pet peeves. And you're a beautiful listener. I want to acknowledge that. But, as you well know, not all people have developed that skill, and it's kind of maddening. And if you can give that to people, they will just think you're the most brilliant conversationalist, even though it may be that you've said nothing more than tell me more.
It's funny. I learned that a long time ago, and it was really counterintuitive to me. They were like, when you go talk to people, talk 10% and listen 90%, and everyone will think you're the best conversationalist, because the reality is everyone just wants to hear themselves talk.
Right.
And it is this, that weird kind of human nature that's out there. And I have found that it works wonders.
It does. And the fact that people love to talk is why, A, it's such a gift if you can be a great listener, and B, why most people aren't great listeners. All right. So and imagine how rare it is in the world of lawyers for somebody to really just sit quietly and say, what's really happening here? I try to give my clients that gift, but I think it's unusual.
I think it is. Again, it comes back to a lot of ego, dealing with that. And how it is. And
For sure.
It is what it is. One of the other things you talk about is to chat about your funeral. And I find it odd, but the stats say that people are all afraid of death. They're all afraid to talk about death. At the end of the day, there's two things that are certain, right? Death and taxes. And so when you look at all the regrets people have when they're dying, it's like, well, there's a simple way not to have those regrets. Think about what you want your funeral to be, and then go live the life that's what the funeral you will have is. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, you've summed it up perfectly. And here's something that you don't know. I wrote this chapter of the book called Facing My Death, and I talked about a cousin of mine who was dying of brain cancer, and he ultimately did pass away, and just how impressed I was with his sense of urgency and presence and so on. And so I talked about in this chapter, people who have had near-death experiences have a sense of gratitude, of urgency, a sense of the preciousness of the limited time that we're all given, and so on. So I wrote that chapter a couple of years ago. I had a near-death experience in January of this year. I had a massive heart attack. My heart stopped for 40 minutes. My wife saved my life by doing CPR, which she learned from the 911 operator. So it was the ultimate close call. And so now I can say that what I said in my chapter actually turns out to be true. I have so many feelings about that. Number one, I don't have a specific recollection of, and about 40% of people with near-death experiences have some memory of a white light or the ancestors or something. I don't specifically have that, but I do absolutely have a very deep feeling of gratitude for the overtime period I've been granted, and just a sense of urgency to kind of get these messages out there. I can well imagine that there might have been some conversation of, we're not quite ready for you here yet. You've still got some work to do. So we're going to spare you and send you back.
We've actually had a few guests who've had near-death experiences, and it changed the trajectory of their life. Now, Most of them, I think, were considerably younger than you were. These were people in their 30s. Well, I think a lot of them were relatively young. And so it made them wake up, because I think, well, like most people, they're asleep. Most people are walking through the motions, not paying any attention.
Yeah. And yet the evidence is all around us. Why should it take some brush with death to make you understand that we have a limited amount of time left, however old you are and however perfect health you are in? You've only got so much time left, so make it count. Make it, cherish every day.
One of the things we haven't talked about, and I think you talk a little bit about it in the book, is perfectionism and this need to always be perfect. And, the funny thing is, I don't think enough people are even paying attention to whether you're perfect or imperfect to begin with. I think that's more an internal dialogue than an external one. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
For me, when I've fallen into perfectionism, it's because I'm so afraid of my inner voice that's so critical. And there's also, that's part of it. Then there's also this notion that I can be in control of everything. And if I control everything perfectly, I'll have a perfect outcome. Then I'll be a perfect person. Everybody will perfectly love me. And to the extent I've become more enlightened about these things, I've realized very few external circumstances are totally within our control. Everybody makes mistakes. If you're not striking out, you're probably not getting up to the plate enough, and so on, whatever analogy you want to use. So to me, I have yet to meet a perfectionist that I thought was very high functioning, because they're not taking enough risks. They're being too hard on themselves and not stretching enough.
And again, that's another counterintuitive thing that we bring up. And it seems like a lot of what we've talked about is somewhat counterintuitive. And unfortunately, none of these things are really taught in school, are they?
Well, not only are they not taught, but the opposite is really how we're incentivized. If you just went through law school and did everything the way you were supposed to and absorbed all the lessons that were being given you, you'd think, okay, so my job is to go out there and have all the right answers, answer everything perfectly, be perfectly prepared, and then everything will be fine. And that is a recipe for disaster.
Well, and nothing can ever be perfect. And with so much stuff going on, and it's got to be hard just trying to figure it all out. Just out of curiosity, and it's kind of a little bit of a left turn here, but how is AI affecting the legal profession in the sense of taking jobs away? Or I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I haven't really seen any hard research on this. Everything that I'm hearing about AI is anecdotal. There is some concern that, AI is going to sort of take over and write briefs and so on. Some courts are now starting to have rules about, you can't use AI unless you identify it and that sort of thing. At the level that we're sort of communicating, I guess I could see it being a useful tool, but I worry that some lawyers will use it as a default and a crutch. Because the most important thing that we bring to a task is a sense of the human realities, how people actually respond to things, their emotions, what's going to be important to a human audience. The brilliant trial lawyers that I've seen were highly intuitive about how people actually react to things. And that's the one thing that AI can't really do. It can form words in a coherent way if it's a high functioning system, but it can't really replicate the way that people actually think and the things that they respond to on an emotional level.
And I'm assuming they won't let you wire up the jury to heart rate monitors and everything else to see.
Well, not yet. I will say that jury research is pretty sophisticated. And I've had trials where I have a jury consultant sitting there with me the whole time. But what you're reacting to, you can't wire them up and you can't talk to them, but you can see their body language. You can see how they kind of react to the other jurors at a body language level. How do they express themselves in jury questioning at the beginning? So you can learn a lot about people, but that's a great example of something where AI just couldn't do it, because there's a million things that go on at an intuitive subconscious level that if you're wired into it, you can see it happening. It's just natural. It's obvious that an AI program could never capture.
And I don't think most people even pay attention to those things. We just kind of gloss over them.
I tell a story in the book about being asked to sit in on a trial and just read some transcripts. So kind of no-brainer exercise. But just sitting there and watching the jury, which had been going on for like 3 weeks, the trial, at a break, I said to a friend of mine who was a lawyer in the case, they said, I think juror number 6 is your foreman, and I think jurors 2 and 4 are pretty good friends with each other. And this other juror is kind of checked out, I think. He said, how the hell did you know all that? Because we've been trying to figure that out for the last 3 weeks, and that's where we came out. But you've just been sitting here for a half an hour. I'm like, well, I was watching. So, that's something that I've tried to develop, is just being really open to exactly what is life trying to tell me right now, and disregard all these legal categories that we're all taught to think in. They come into play, but first you got to gather the raw materials.
And because you had no skin in the game for that case,
exactly,
could actually take the time to do that.
Yeah.
Is there anything in the book that we should have talked about but didn't get a chance to?
I do like chapter 6, which is about control. And it was excerpted at a seminar convention that I went to recently, and people liked it. And the point I'm trying to make is we're all taught to live in such a way that we control the outcomes and we achieve a certain result, and we make ourselves miserable because we keep learning that we're not actually in control of things. How much better and healthier to start off with that understanding and just use all our skills to navigate that as gracefully and intelligently as we can, but understand you are not in control of ultimate outcomes. I've said that to clients. I can give you my ultimate attention, but I'm not going to promise you how this will turn out. That's a good reason to settle, by the way, because a good lawyer will tell you that. But you can be in control every minute of every day, in the sense that you can decide how you're going to respond to every input that you get. You can choose to listen attentively. You can choose to be present. So that's what I think of as really being in control.
And it's learning what you can and can't control, right? And learning to let go of the things that you can't. Because if you try and control the uncontrollable, you'll drive yourself crazy. And I know I do it all the time. Little by little, learn to let go.
We all fall into that trap, but think about kind of what position that puts you in. If you're in control of everything and things go wrong, it's your fault. So we beat ourselves up and we say, just back up a step, take a breath, understand you're not really in control of all this. Let's just do our best.
So true. It's time to learn the secrets of life. What's your secret to living an abundant life?
Being present and authentic and self-accepting.
Great point. So succinct. What did you learn later in life that you wish you would have learned sooner?
It's all in my book. But for me, as we discussed right at the beginning, it really had a lot to do with just understanding that I'm an emotional being. That's how I present to the world, and to embrace that rather than despise it.
And it's also learning to understand your feelings and what's driving them, and learning to experience them and figure out how to make them be okay for you.
Yep.
If you were to give an 18-year-old one specific piece of wisdom, what would it be?
Keep learning, listen to the advice of people who have gone before you, and recognize that every day at age 18 is just as valuable as a day at age 70. So don't put off living your life while you're achieving some distant goal.
And I think that's a big part of it. When you're young, you just don't appreciate time. You don't understand. Youth is wasted on the young. Is that what they say? If people would like to learn more about you, the law firm, the book, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, my book is available on Amazon. It's called Rewiring the White Collar Mind, and available there in all formats. In fact, I have an audio book that I'm just putting the finishing touches on. And they can reach me on my website, charlespriceesquire.com, charlespriceesq.com. I think I mentioned it in passing, Rocky, but I do private coaching, and I love talking to both younger professionals and older professionals about all the concepts in my book, and doing, in-person private coaching about all those things.
And you also speak about it, so they can reach out for that as well.
Definitely.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Been my pleasure.
What was your biggest takeaway from this episode? Couple that I saw is focus on being present, authentic, and accepting yourself every day. You already know you've got to know your ideal vision for your days and for your life. The other one that we probably haven't talked about as much is to listen deeply to others instead of talking. As a matter of fact, that's what this podcast allows me to do, to listen, to understand, and to discern from what others are doing. This one's one I struggle with. See, I want to control everything. You know what? It creates nothing but stress. And lastly, just appreciate every day, no matter where you are in your career or in your life. We're all getting older. Hopefully you're getting wiser. So here's the question. What's one of those things that you can incorporate, make a difference in your life, and bring about change? Couple quick things as we wrap this up. Who else do you know who needs to listen to this episode? And would you be so kind as to share it with them? Next week, we've got Jen Drummond to talk about her book, Quit Proof: The 7 Necessities for Becoming Resilient. She's got an amazing story that I know you're going to love. Thanks for listening. Have an abundant week.